that we have. It's really more of just an introduction of some of the basics of how to get started in this process. And it also keep in mind that it's an ongoing process that will and should continue throughout your career as an interpreter of the National Park Service. So go ahead and get started here. Basically, the learning objectives for this afternoon are to identify a relationship between a resource, a visitor, and interpretation. We're going to talk about what tangible and intangible resources and universal concepts mean, what those terms mean. Take a look at some key components of a well-organized interpretive program, and then just kind of touch on a few presentation techniques. Talk a little bit about some of the mechanics of how this is done. Start out with a little bit of philosophy about interpretation, as to why we do interpretation. If you look the word up and try to find a definition, you're going to find a number of different definitions of it. These are just a couple that I picked out. If you are like me, usually if you tell someone who is not familiar with interpretation that you are an interpreter, they're generally going to want to know what language it is you interpret, because they're thinking of it differently. But basically what we're talking about is any activity that's directed toward the enlightenment of the public. And then, within the profession, we define that a little further as a process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resources. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means as we go along. To understand the role of interpretation in this process, we have to take a look at the relationship between the resource and the visitor. And there are three basic tenets that we talk about in looking at this aspect. And the first is that the resources possess meaning and have relevance. Now, the meanings of the resource may not always necessarily be the same for each visitor. In fact, it's probably not going to be the same in a lot of cases, because the resources act as tangible icons, or the focus for meanings. So two visitors that come to Lincoln Boyhood may derive meaning from the resources here, but the meanings are different. For instance, if a person is a Lincoln aficionado and they're coming here to learn more about Abraham Lincoln and about his time here in Indiana, that's the resources we have are going to be relevant to them in that regard. On the other hand, especially this time of year, we get a lot of visitors who are camping at the state park across the road from us and come over here to our living historical farm, and they're looking for some sort of a fun activity for the family to do together. So they come to the farm to see the animals, to see what's going on up there. So two different visitors, two different meanings, but the same resource involved in both cases, and each meaning is equally valid. So it's just something to keep in mind. Which kind of leads into the second tenet, which is that the visitor seeks something of value for him or herself. Okay, they believe that there's something worthwhile in the resource. For the Lincoln person, it's the connection to Abraham Lincoln. For the family who's looking for a family activity, that's the connection that they have with the resource. So again, it just depends upon the individual. Interpretation, what we do in interpretation is we try to facilitate some sort of a connection between the interest of the visitor and the meanings of the resource. So for that family that comes over looking for a family activity, they may not necessarily be all that interested in Abraham Lincoln. That may not be what motivates their visit to the park. But once they're here, through our interpretive activities, we have an opportunity to facilitate a connection between their desire to engage in a family activity and the connection that these resources have with Abraham Lincoln. So that's really all we're looking to do with interpretation, is to facilitate some sort of a connection. But we want to always keep in mind that the visitor is sovereign. that they'll decide for themselves what the value of the experience and the resources are. Um, all our visitors exist on somewhere on some level what we call a continuum of stewardship. They may come in here with a very clear understanding of why the resources need to be preserved. They may be at the opposite end of the spectrum and really have no sense that stewardship is or should be a concern. Or they may be somewhere in between, and that's perfectly okay. I mean, one's not better than another. We don't want to get into a situation of judging where they're at on that continuum. But what we want to try to do through our interpretation is, if they're over on this side where they don't really understand the stewardship idea, that maybe we can move them along a little further on that continuum. Now, interpretation fulfills the mission of the Park Service in several different ways. It shows the heritage of the nation. It helps make that heritage available and more accessible. Provides experiences that strengthen enjoyment, and gives the visitor a chance to give the resources meaning, which will lead them to be concerned for them. Because if the visitors are not concerned about the resources, they're not going to feel as if there is any need to preserve them. So it's really just the seed of resource stewardship that we're going for here. That's our ultimate goal with interpretation. It's not a mere recitation of facts and information, but that we're wanting to kind of plant these seeds along the way. We also want to keep in mind that visitors have certain rights, kind of inalienable rights when they come to a park. The first is to have their privacy and independence respected. Like I say, they may be at different places on that continuum. They've got different reasons for coming, and that's all okay. We need to respect those reasons and respect their privacy. Some visitors come to a park and they want to experience it on their own terms, on at their own level, whatever that might be. We often talk about doing interpretation. Interpretation really isn't something that we should do to people. Some folks are going to come and connect to the resource without our involvement, and that's okay too. They have a right to have their privacy and independence respected, and to retain and express their own values. I mean, we're not out to judge people as to why they're visiting the park or how they feel about these things. They come in with their own set of values. We need to be respectful of that as well. Treat them with courtesy and consideration, which is again kind of part of this whole thing of respect. Sometimes that's going to be easier to do than at others. If it's a relatively quiet day and you've got visitors who are really interested in the resource, asking a lot of good questions and stuff, it can be pretty easy at those points to be courteous and that type of thing. On the other hand, if it's a really busy day, you're just swamped with visitors, you're overwhelmed, and the visitors are perhaps not terribly courteous themselves, then that becomes much more of a challenge to do. And yet they are still entitled to that courtesy. And they have the right to receive accurate and balanced information. We have a certain legitimacy just by virtue of putting on the uniform, I think, a lot of times. There's a certain expectation there as far as the quality and accuracy of the information that people come in expect to get when they come to a national park. So we have an obligation to make sure that the information that we're sharing with them is as accurate as we can know it to be, and that it's balanced information, that it's not skewed in one way or another. So these are all things to keep in mind as far as the Visitor's Bill of Rights. So that's just a little bit of the general philosophy behind interpretation. Take a little bit of time now and look at some of the more nuts and bolts of how to get a program prepared and put together. Again, just keep in mind, this is just an introduction. Some of this stuff may be very familiar to some of you, some of it might be new to some of you. But it's still, even if it is something you're very familiar with, it's good to have a refresher in these things. Now this, if you're not familiar with this information, this right here may be somewhat off-putting or intimidating. I know for me, part of the reason why I became a history major was to get away from math and algebraic looking formulas like this. But it's really not as complicated as it first appears. The Ka plus Kr times At equals IO just means knowledge of the resource plus knowledge of the audience times appropriate techniques equals interpretive opportunities. And that's really what we're going for here, are interpretive opportunities. Again, we're not looking to do interpretation to people, but to provide these opportunities. So with knowledge of the audience, we're just considering certain things. First of all, there is no such thing as the average visitor. Each visitor that comes into our parks is unique in some way. And so we want to guard against treating them all the same. And also another thing is to realize that it's not always necessary for a visitor to have an intensive interpretive experience. Again, this goes back to respecting their independence and their privacy. We need to recognize and respect personal values and interests of the visitors, and just generally keep in mind, like I say, that Bill of Rights that we talked about a minute ago. So some of the things that are involved in knowledge of the audience. Now, in knowledge of the resource, what we mean by that is that knowledge is more than just facts. We can possess a lot of facts, but if we're unable to put those facts within some sort of a broader context, then they remain just that, just facts. We want to have some sort of a broad knowledge of the park's history and of the park's story. We also want to try to avoid, if at all possible, bland or boring facts. Just giving a lot of statistics about something might be impressive to a certain degree. I mean, if you're talking about the Grand Canyon or something, you talk about how old it is and how deep it is, those statistics are impressive. But if they're left as just statistics without being put within any kind of a broader context, they don't have as much meaning as they might have otherwise. So we want to accommodate multiple points of view, have accurate material again, and then use the knowledge that we have to convey interpretive themes. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute as well. Knowledge of appropriate techniques just has to do with, again, kind of some of the mechanics of it. Choose a technique that fits with your program, whatever it might be, whether it's a guided walk or guided, or just a stationary tour or something like that. Be current with your techniques, but try to avoid being trendy. And then just constantly evaluate the effectiveness. A lot of self-evaluation as you do these things and try them and see how different things work. And you may find that some work and some don't. There are different types of audiences, everything from subject matter experts. So for instance, if you work at a Civil War park, you may get a class of military students in to visit your site. Or we get groups of Lincoln experts that come and visit here. Or it might be geologists or biologists or whatever the case may be. Another type of audience is students. I think we've all dealt with school groups pretty heavily. For us here, between about mid-April and Memorial Day, that's pretty much all we do, are school field trips. International visitors, other types of tour groups, these can be like your senior citizen bus tours, that type of thing, and other types of groups, physically or mentally challenged individuals. Each of these types of audiences brings with it unique challenges and opportunities, and you want to consider the type of audience you're talking to, or that you're going to be talking to, before you do your program, because it will dictate to some degree what approach you take. Subject matter experts, for instance, you may be able to go into a whole lot more detail. They may, in fact, want you to go into a whole lot more detail about the resource than, say, a tour, just a regular tour group. Certainly, your approach with students should be different than with some of the adult groups. So, just like I say, they each provide or come with their own unique opportunities. So when we're looking at putting together a program or getting ready for a program, we want to think about organization. You may have all the knowledge in the world. You may be very familiar with the resource, have all kinds of information that you can share, but if you don't present it in some sort of an organized manner, that's going to limit the effectiveness of your program. So through organization, you can create an introduction, you can develop strong points to support your theme, develop your ideas, connect tangible objects or facts to universal concepts. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then, wrap it all up with a good conclusion. Just having that basic organization, going through that process, not only makes the presentation of your program, I think, more effective, it's a good exercise for us to do as well, to sit down and try to think through the things that we want to talk about and how we want to talk about it, and put it all together. It just kind of helps focus things for us as well. There are a number of different kinds of organizational tools that you can use. Traditional outline, block outline, brainstorming. The specific tool you use isn't as important, I don't think, as just the process itself. I mean, find something that works best for you. For me personally, I tend to use traditional outline. That was kind of the way I learned in school and early in my career, so that's what I do. But it may not be the right technique for you. Like I say, the tool is not as important as just sitting down and going through the process. Now, when you're looking at your organizational structure, just a few things you want to think about. Identify yourself. I mean, we all do wear name tags when we're in uniform, but don't make the mistake of thinking that that's enough, because not everybody in your group may be able to see your name tag. So just a simple, hi, I'm Mike. I'm going to be doing your program today. Some agency identification. Again, it might appear to be obvious if we're in uniform, but it might not be as obvious as you think it is. Like I say, we have Lincoln State Park directly across the highway from us, and a lot of our visitation, especially this time of year, are people who are camping in the state park and then come over here to visit us. They see people in uniform there, they see people in uniform here. They don't always make the distinction that they're different agencies. So just, saying, hi, I'm Mike with the National Park Service, welcome to Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial, just kind of helps identify the agency and lets them know, too, that they're in a national park. They might not actually know that when they first get here. Safety messages, announcements, that's going to depend on where you're at and what type of program you're doing. If I'm doing a program in the museum here, I might have a few safety tips, but it's not going to be anything terribly extensive. But yesterday, I and my staff went down to Mammoth Cave and took a cave tour. Well, the safety message at the beginning of that program was fairly lengthy for obvious reasons, so there was much more to talk about. Think about introducing your theme. What is your main point, how you're going to kind of help illustrate that as you go along, and then how you're going to sum it up at the end. So just all things to think about when you're going through this process of organizing your program. Another important part of doing any program is doing good research. And you want to find information and material that's objective, balanced, credible, verifiable, and relevant to the themes. What I always tell my new interpreters here is that look at more than one source. Don't rely on one source alone for your information. You may, in fact, come up with sources that are conflicting in one way or another, or may not agree in all aspects. So look at a number of different sources, and then, if you find two or three that are similar, as opposed to one over here that is completely different, then that lends a little more credence to the two or three over here, and might in fact be more reliable information. There are a number of different sources that you can look at, libraries, archives, a lot of stuff within the park. It may sound pretty elementary, but read the park brochure, especially if you're new to a park. I mean, if you're going to be standing there and you're going to be talking to visitors and handing out a park brochure, it's probably a good idea to be familiar with what's in that brochure. Look at site bulletins, other information handouts that have been prepared by the staff. Personnel from other disciplines. If you're doing a program on park geology, and the park has a geologist, it might be a good idea to speak to that individual, or a biologist, or whatever the case may be. Talk to other interpreters. You can benefit from their experience. But you do need to be a little bit careful about that sometimes, because sometimes things get incorporated into interpretive programs at parks, not necessarily because it's the best information or the most accurate information, but because it's information that's been repeated the most over the years. So you want to be careful of those kinds of things, and especially if you're in a position where you are kind of evaluating the overall park interpretive program, is you want to be aware of those kinds of things, and try to. Sometimes you might have to say, well, I know that this is something that y'all have been repeating for many, many years. However, I don't really think this is the most accurate information. So that you can look to other personnel, but you just want to keep that in mind as well. Now, we don't talk about goals and objectives and things like that as much as we used to when I was starting out in interpretation, but they're still valid ideas. You want to have these goals and objectives when you're putting together a program. Now, basically, goals refer to things that you're trying to attain, which you may or may not reach, and that may not, and in fact often will not be easily measurable. So, for instance, here at Lincoln Boyhood, we have several of these goals and objectives for our interpretive program. And so a goal for us would be to give visitors an idea of how the physical, emotional, and intellectual environment of this place, where Lincoln spent 14 formative years of his life, influenced his development into an adult. Okay, now that's a goal, an example of what we call a goal. It's something that we're trying to attain. We want people to understand what this time and place meant to Abraham Lincoln and how that affected his life. Now, it's a worthy goal, but we may or may not always reach that goal, and it's going to be pretty tough for us to measure if we've reached that goal or not. Now, objectives, on the other hand, tend to be more specific. They often involve some sort of action, and it is easier to measure them. So, keeping in mind that goal that we have here, a couple of our objectives then are to relate information in a relevant and interesting manner about specific people and experiences that had an impact on Abraham Lincoln. So now we're going to talk about specific people. So like if we're going to talk about how Abraham Lincoln's family influenced his development, then we might look at his father, Thomas Lincoln, as a specific example. And then within that example, pick out a certain quality that his father helped contribute to him. For instance, Thomas Lincoln had a reputation for honesty. People that knew him described him as a very honest man. Abraham Lincoln also had a reputation for honesty. So, you can draw the conclusion that he very likely learned this behavior from his father, and that influenced the development of his character. So you're talking about a specific person, a specific experience, and how that contributed to his development as a person. So then it kind of relates back to the goal. Another objective would be that we have is to demonstrate specific pioneer skills that would likely have been a part of Lincoln's life as a means of helping the visitor to better understand the world in which he grew up and what part that world played in shaping his character. So, at our Living Historical Farm, we actively demonstrate specific pioneer skills as a means of attaining our goal, which is to help people understand the environment in which he grew up. And we have an opportunity there, especially at the farm, for people to become directly involved, actively involved in these things. So, it's one thing to talk about how the experience of living on a frontier where you had to carry water 100 yards from the spring to the cabin. It's one thing to talk about that, but if you have a visitor who can then actually try doing that themselves, it helps them understand better, I think, how that experience taught him things like the importance of hard work and survival instincts and that sort of thing. So just a couple of examples of goals and objectives. Now, themes is kind of the whole thing wrapped up into one. It ties it all together. It can be used as an introduction and conclusion for your program, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be clearly stated as an introduction or a conclusion. It can be something that just kind of emerges or becomes apparent over the course of the program. And I think the more you do a particular program, the more often it is that it'll get to that point where it just kind of emerges or becomes apparent as you go along. But again, coming back to our example of Lincoln Boyhood, a couple of our themes, and you can have more than one theme that are kind of related. One would be that the 14 years that Abraham Lincoln spent in Indiana were crucial in his physical development and in the formation of his intellect and character, and that the experience of growing up in a frontier environment played a key role in his growth and development as well. So these are kind of the big ideas, the themes, and then you tie your goals and your objectives to that theme, which leads us into a discussion of what we call tangibles and intangibles. Now, again, you may or may not have heard of these things, these particular terms, but basically tangible resources are just those that you can see or touch, physical features, buildings, artifacts, that kind of thing. But it's important to remember that objects only have meaning within a larger context. Their significance must be linked to ideas and values. I would hazard a guess that probably most, if not all of us, have at one time or another found ourselves on a furniture tour. Might be at a historic house most often where this happens, where you go through on the tour and the well-meaning guide points out to you the various objects, pieces of furniture, the Queen Anne chair, or Louis XIV this or that, or the writing desk, which might be somewhat interesting, especially if you are really into furniture. However, if that's all the information you get, then that object really has no context. It doesn't have, you don't understand the significance of it. Seeing a writing desk might be somewhat interesting. Knowing that that writing desk was where Abraham Lincoln sat to write the Emancipation Proclamation Now it's a whole different thing. Now you can understand the context of that tangible resource. Um, Tangible resources can be places. Sometimes just being in a place where something of great significance occurred can have a transforming effect. I grew up reading an awful lot about the Civil War and reading about places like Antietam and Gettysburg. And through that reading, I learned a lot. I could tell you a lot of things about those particular events. When the first time that I visited those sites, though, those places that became touchstones for me then. Now I understood where these things had happened. Now I could see where all the things I'd read about had actually transpired. And so just being in that place was terribly significant for me. And then events may be as important as where it happened. So, in the case, like I say, being at Gettysburg was a significant experience for me. Now, if the Battle of Gettysburg, or if the Gettysburg battlefield no longer existed, if it had been paved over or wasn't there for whatever reason, that wouldn't take away from the significance of what happened there, of the event. But because the tangible evidence of that battlefield is still there, I can connect to that event in a way I wouldn't be otherwise be able to. Which leads to the idea of intangibles, something that cannot be seen or touched, like a past event, or in some cases people, systems, ideas, those kinds of things. Processes, it can range from a massive geologic process. If you're at Grand Canyon, you're going to be talking about those kinds of things. To social and economic processes as part of our heritage and culture of our history, of our country. I spent some time, a few years, working at Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis, or the Arch, where our theme was westward expansion. So we talked about that process of westward expansion a lot, and all the various aspects of that. That was an intangible that we dealt with. Systems, biological to social systems, ideas can be intangibles, values, and they're things that people connect to or have some understanding of on some level, but the intangible meanings of the tangible resources may not necessarily be the same for each individual, which kind of leads into the idea of universal concepts. With universal concepts, we're dealing with intangible ideas or resources that almost everyone can relate to in some way. They provide the greatest degree of relevance and meaning to the greatest number of people. So some examples of universal concepts would be things like birth, death, freedom, survival, these kinds of big ideas. Now, again, people's concepts, their connections to those concepts may not necessarily be the same. We have visitors that come in here, and one of the kind of the universal concepts that we deal with here is the one of death, because Abraham Lincoln's mother died during the time they were living here in Indiana, and that was a defining incident in his life. So we talk about that. So people understand that most all people have some understanding of death. Now, they may not have the same understanding of it, but they're going to be able to have some concept of that and gain some understanding of how that event perhaps affected Abraham Lincoln's life. This is a painting that we have here in the Visitor Center here at Lincoln Boyhood. It is a painting of the Ohio River, of the place on the river where we believe the Lincolns crossed from Kentucky into Indiana, and it is the artist's conception of what the area looked like at the time, much more heavily forested than it is now. So this is a tangible resource that we have here. We can use this tangible resource to tie into a number of intangibles, for instance, transportation. that is something that visitors understand. They have a concept of transportation. However, they may have a very different concept than Abraham Lincoln and the early 19th century pioneers did. So, I'll ask them things like, well, how did you get here to the park today? And it usually involves, cars and roads and that kind of thing. So then I can talk about how, well, they didn't have a lot of, they didn't have any cars, they didn't have a lot of roads, that the rivers were the primary means of transportation. That the rivers, and especially ones like the Ohio, were in fact the interstate highways, the superhighways of the time. And so how that affected Lincoln's life and how that experience is different certainly than the visitors who are coming now, but that intangible idea of transportation is still the same. The same thing we talk about, like opportunity. Crossing that river represented a new opportunity for Thomas Lincoln and his family. The adventure. Abraham Lincoln took a flatboat trip down the Ohio River when he was 18 years old. There was a certain adventurous aspect of that for him. So just examples of how you can take a tangible resource like this painting, which doesn't even necessarily have to be, something that Abraham Lincoln touched or did or anything himself, but it's still a resource at the park, and connecting it to some of these intangibles and some of these bigger concepts. So, presentation techniques, just a little bit about some of the mechanics of this. And they're going to change a lot depending on what kind of a program you're doing and where you're at, and just as you find out what does and doesn't work for you over time. But when you're getting ready to do a program, you want to think about certain things. Logistics is a big thing to think about. You need to be ready for anything because you want to ensure a smooth presentation and a professional presentation of your information. So think about things like sun in the audience's eyes. If you've got them facing the sun, they can't see you, they're going to be distracted. That's going to interfere with the effectiveness of your program. Varied sizes of groups. If you're dealing with a group of visitors, 10, 12 visitors, you can relate to them, you will relate to them on a much different basis than if you're dealing with a group of 150 fourth graders. It's just a fact. You're going to have to change your style and your approach a little bit. Think about the weather. From what I understand, many of us are in the same boat, especially today, with it being very, very hot and very, very humid outside. So if you're going to do a program, you think about consider the weather. Maybe you want to do that program at 9 o'clock in the morning as opposed to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Look for interpretive moments, those times that just kind of present themselves during the course of a program that you can take advantage of. Think about possible distractions. Here at our park, we do have a living historical farm. We attempt to do everything in as historical a manner as we can, from the way we dress to the way we do things and the tools we use, all to try to kind of help create this atmosphere. However, right along the western boundary of our park, less than a quarter of a mile away, is a railroad track. And it's a pretty heavily used railroad track. So there are trains that come through there on a regular basis, and there is a road crossing, so they blow the whistle as they go across the crossing. That is a major distraction. So you just need to, plan for those things. We would love to not have that distraction. We don't always know exactly when the trains are going to come, so we just plan for it and know that if it happens during the program, you just stop and wait until it's over, and then you continue. If you're using AV equipment, think about that. Make sure everything's working properly. It's nothing quite as panic-inducing as having equipment that doesn't work on you at the last minute or in the middle of a program. Think about acoustics. Can the audience hear you? Can you hear them? Should they be asking you questions? That sort of thing. So, if at all possible, preview the site. Get an idea of where, so that you can decide where to put people so they're not facing into the sun and that kind of thing. Check your equipment ahead of time. Have backup plans. We don't talk about this so much since we don't use slide projectors anymore, but kind of a cardinal rule was anytime you did a slide program, you always took along an extra bulb. Just have some spare parts on hand in case you do have equipment failures. And think about some of these things ahead of time and then try to plan out some solutions. Once you're there, it's, try, if at all possible, especially if it's a talk or a program that's at a scheduled time, to be there early. Don't have visitors waiting on you to show up. Use that time that you have before the program starts to just interact with the group a little bit. It kind of sets the tone, helps you relate to the audience, create a little bit of group dynamic, and that sort of thing. Once you're actually involved in doing the program, there are a number of tools that you can use. Presentation tools. These are going to vary from program to program. You may not use them all the time, but you can use things like forecast a little bit, maybe something that's coming up later on your tour. Sometimes you can use things like silence. Silence can be very effective if you use it well. You don't want to create an awkward silence, but sometimes just pausing at some point along the way in your program can be very effective. Sometimes letting the visitor just kind of experience that resource without your involvement for a moment might be a very effective way of doing things. If you're going to talk about, like for instance on our tour yesterday of Mammoth Cave, you talk about the interpreter talked about how quiet it can be in the cave. And to illustrate that point, he turned off the lights and asked everyone to be very quiet. And that was a very powerful moment because that was much more effective than having him just tell me that it's quiet in the cave, being able to experience it. So that was a good example of use of silence. You can use these presentation tools anywhere within the program. Be selective. Don't just, there are tools that are available to you and lists of examples and things that you can use. Don't feel like you have to include all of them in any one program. Sometimes you're going to find that one technique works one time with one group. It may not work another time with another group. So you just got to experiment and practice these things as you go along. Questioning is another way, another technique that you can use. It kind of sparks interest and maintains the audience involvement. I have here, it says it can provoke the audience. You want to be careful of that. You want to provoke the audience in a good way, not in a negative way. Sometimes if you come across seem aggressive with your questioning, that can in fact provoke your audience, but it's not necessarily the way you should go about it. There's a whole variety of questions, types of questions that can be used, the memory, open-ended, rhetorical. One of the things I like to do when I'm dealing with school kids here is we do a tour through the visitor center. We move from one spot to another and talk about different things. And what I like to do is to ask them questions about, when we get to the second stop, ask them questions about the things we talked about in the first stop. So, for instance, I might, in my introduction or overview, talk about some of the different people in Abraham Lincoln's life, in his family, his mom and his dad, and that sort of thing. Then when I get to the point in the tour when I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about his mother, I'll just ask him. I'll say, okay, well, who was Abraham Lincoln's mom? What was her name again? And it just kind of keeps him involved and helps you, too, to kind of reinforce certain pieces of information as you go along. So there's a variety of ways that you can do these things as well. When it comes to delivering that talk, your comfort level is going to be somewhat dependent on a lot of things. How well prepared you are. I think we all agree that if we feel like we're well prepared, that's going to make us feel more comfortable than if we kind of uncertain. If we are comfortable with our knowledge level, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have all of the knowledge, and it doesn't mean that you need to share all the knowledge either. I mean, you may have a great deal of knowledge, but it may not always be necessary, and is probably not even desirable to share all that knowledge with every group. You don't want to overwhelm people with information. So it's kind of part of reading your audience sometimes, and knowing kind of how much they would like to know, and what would be appropriate to share with them. And then practice. A lot of this is just, the more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to start to feel with it, the more at ease you're going to be, and that's going to help you then to think about things like, okay, I'm going to talk about my theme, I'm going to talk about these tangibles and intangibles, how to connect them, and you'll be less worried about other things that can be a distraction to you. When you're talking, your voice, you want to think about your volume, your rate, your pitch, all these other kinds of things. One thing that I personally have to remind myself of often is that I don't always articulate and enunciate the way that I should, and consequently people don't always understand what I'm saying. I also have just kind of a bad habit that I've worked on for years and still haven't completely conquered, but I know that I tend to drop off the volume at the end of my sentences. And I may have probably have in fact even done that this afternoon. I'm not always aware of it. I'm aware that I do it, but I'm not always aware of it as I'm doing it. So I have to really work on that and try to make sure that I don't fall into that pattern. So there's things like that you may find when you're doing your talk. Watch your nonverbal language, your posture. Eye contact is very important. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go through and make eye contact with every single individual in the group, but just enough that people know that you know they're there, and that you care that they are there. And it's a good way too to read your audience, to know, okay, am I communicating my information effectively, or have they checked out? This particular format of doing things, this webcast, is something that's new to me, and it's a bit of a challenge for me because I can't make eye contact with anyone who's out there. I see your names on the list, so I assume you are out there, but I can't make that eye contact and have that interaction. So that is a little bit of a challenge. Movement for emphasis. There's good and bad to that as well. When I'm talking to a group in front of them, I tend to move back and forth. So even just sitting still like this is a challenge for me. At the same time, I have to be careful not to do that too much, because if you move too much back and forth, then that can be a distraction for people as well. They get, it's like, is the guy ever going to stop pacing, and they're not really listening to what you're talking about at that point. Gestures, can be used to make a lot of points. They can be used to emphasize certain points, reinforce things. You want to be careful with that, though, because, again, you don't want to gesture too much so that it becomes a distraction. And depending upon what type of audience you have, you may want to be careful with the gestures that you do, that someone in that audience, for cultural reasons or whatever, may in fact find that gesture offensive in some way. So again, it's part of kind of knowing your audience. So that's a real quick overview of some things to think about when putting together an interpretive program. Hopefully, we've achieved some of these objectives that we had here this afternoon of looking at the resource, the visitor, interpretation, discussing the relationship, how tangibles, intangibles, universals work together.
Thank you very much, Mike. If the participants would please fill out the polls that we have up on the screen, that would be great. And thank you very much for attending our webinar.
Has any questions at this point, or anything that you would like to share? But I'll turn it back over to Jeremy now.
Thank you very much, Mike. If the participants that we have on the screen, that would be great, and thank you very much for attending our webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, for coming this afternoon. It's an ongoing process, Carmen. We're all still learning. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Laurel, Jan. And Lindsay. That's a good point, Gary. The lighting, I noticed myself, is different this afternoon than it was this morning. So, yeah, I'm not sure that having my face in shadows was necessarily a negative thing. But like I say, this is the first time I've ever done this, so learning new things, especially for us old dogs, is a bit of a challenge sometimes. And it's not always necessary, Carmen, to write everything out in your outline. If you are aware of the techniques and if you are familiar and comfortable with how to use them and where to use them, that's the more important thing. The thing about writing stuff out in an outline, well, oftentimes why us supervisors ask people to do that is just that we want you to think about it. We want you to think, how can you use these things, and how can you apply this knowledge that you have of these techniques. So if you know how to use them and you're comfortable with using them and those kinds of things within your program, that's really what's most important. The writing them out in an outline is more of an exercise just to kind of get you to think about it. And I think that's true. The more that you do these programs, the more aware that you become of using some of these things. And you experiment all the time. I've tried I know I can think of things that I used to do in programs that I don't do anymore because I found that for one reason or another they just really weren't all that effective. And sometimes too, um, what you might find is that you have an opportunity within a program to do something you've never done before, use a technique or whatever that is just something that comes to you as you're given the program. And you try it, you do it, and it works great. And so then you can incorporate that into future times if it works again. It may or may not. I mean, audience dynamics and all these kinds of things, it's really a pretty fluid situation. You're welcome, Carmen. Thank you. And if at any time any of you all have any other questions or you'd like to just talk about any of this stuff at all, feel free to contact me. You can contact me by email or get a phone number, which is on our park's website or whatever. I mean, I'd be glad to talk about any of this stuff in more detail if that would help. And that's good, Sarah. That you have experiences like that where it works. Just keep in mind that it might not always work every time. So you may have to adjust. That's where you kind of have a lot of these things in your back pocket so that you can pull them out at various times and use them in various ways.